Welcome back to another episode of the Still Curtain podcast. I'm your host, Tommy Jaggi, and joining me as always is Shayne Kubas, contributor for Still Curtain. We're going to talk about the Super Bowl a little bit here, and we're also going to break down the most frequently mocked players to the Pittsburgh Steelers so far this offseason. A couple of names on that list are not going to surprise you at all. We're going to talk about their fits potentially with the team. But Shayne, let's first start by the trending topics this week. And that is the Chiefs defeat the Eagles in the Super Bowl. I think we learned a lot from this game, and we're going to break that down even further. We're going to talk about what the Steelers, the notes that they should have been taking from this game and some of the things that they should do. But let's just talk about this game specifically for a little bit, Shayne. What are your overall thoughts on the Super Bowl? Did you like how that game turned out?
Overall, I mean, it was a great game, 38-35. I believe the first time both teams have scored 35 plus points in the Super Bowl. Just one of the biggest, high flying acts we've ever seen, and that was despite some questionable field conditions, which may or may not have helped depending on how you look at it with the scoring. But yeah, just so much fun, really good game, big comeback from the Chiefs. Mahomes comes out from that supposed ankle injury. It didn't really look like he injured it more once he got in the second half, but definitely was able to come back from that. Really have a great game. I think the thing I'll take away the most from it, though, is the fact that Jalen Hurts is that guy. He's this was not a fluke. This was not a situation where they just went on a big run and their defense is great and everything. He pretty much, outside of that weird fumble 6 situation, carried this team the entire time and really would have probably had a chance to at least take it to overtime if it weren't for that call at the end of the game. So.
Yeah, I mean, Hurts obviously looked good. You score 35 points in the Super Bowl. You're doing something right.
Yeah,
I know he's got a good, talented team around him. But I mean, man, he was just inches away from pulling that game off. And Shane and I were talking about this before. Hurts is going to get paid here very soon. So that's going to be a big contract the Eagles are going to have to decide on here. But it's hard to argue against it when the results were good. And he had a pass rating of 103.4 in the Super Bowl. Makes you wonder that game probably turns out a lot different if he doesn't fumble and it's not picked up for a touchdown there. But definitely a good game to watch. Controversial call a little bit at the end there. Yeah. I know it was kind of a trending topic there on Twitter, but I think it probably was the right call. It's just not consistent call because there were other things that happened in that game and the officials were not consistent with it at all. Like we talked about Jason Kelce going down, legal man downfield. And there were a few things on the Eagles that weren't called either that nobody's really bringing attention to. So I think overall, it was a pretty well officiated game compared to the championship games that we saw. Some very questionable stuff there. So I can't blame the officiating too much. I think they gave us a good Super Bowl. I would have liked to see it end without that call, but a good game nonetheless. So let's shift the tension over, Shayne, to Juju's tweet right now. If you haven't seen it, Juju tweeted. His tweet was essentially aimed at James Bradbury, the defensive back that was called for their defensive holding late in the game that basically put the game on ice for the Chiefs. And he had a little Valentine's Day with Bradbury's picture. It said, "I'll hold you when it matters most." And that was met with some backlash. And I think probably rightfully so. I know I'm sure he probably did it in good fun, knowing Juju, but yeah, I mean, that wasn't received particularly well.
So with Juju, I will say, and I think we talked about a little bit during free agency and everything like that, and where he was going to go and everything. I was always a fan of him as a player, obviously, and I think he's a funny guy, right? He does stuff that obviously rubs people the wrong way sometimes, but I don't like it when we try to control who players are, their personalities. So I try to let that stuff go unless it gets too ridiculous or personal. This one, admittedly, I laughed when I saw it because I just think it's generally funny. I think that's what he was going for. I don't think he was trying to be have any animosity towards Brett, anything like that. I think he was just trying to poke fun. It was, it was a really good game. I think both teams feel good about how they played for the most part. But I also understand why people are a little bit upset about it. It's kind of one of those too soon type of situations. Then again, you can't really wait any longer because it's, if you're going to make this joke, you have to do it yesterday. But it's tough. I think if you're James Bradbury, especially the way he handled it, where he did say, I held him like I did. Maybe they shouldn't have called it still because of other things, but I did it. And the Eagles handled it very well. I think maybe could have gone without doing this, but at the same time, this is kind of what he does. He does stuff on social media. He's fun. He likes to mess around. And it is kind of what it is, I think, with Juju with that.
Yeah, there were a lot of athletes. I even saw some NBA players quote tweeting and commenting on that as well. But one of them that was not particularly happy with it was
Yeah.
AJ Brown,
Yes.
receiver for the Eagles, come to the defense of his teammate. And I understand that because I mean, that's a tough loss to stomach.
It
And
is. Yes.
especially when I don't want to say decided by that call, because I think the Chiefs probably would have won anyway. They had the
Yeah.
control of the game. They had the momentum. They were at least getting a field goal out of that, and it would have forced the Eagles to come down and get their field goal to tie the game with less than a minute and 30 left or something like that. And so, but yeah, it's Brown was not too happy
No.
with what
No. He
Juju
was
had to
not.
say there, and
Yeah.
kind of called him the TikTok boy and
Of course. Yeah.
stick to
That's
what
what
you
we get.
do and that all that kind of jazz. So I see we got somebody popping in the chat here. If you have
Yeah.
any questions for us here on the YouTube
Yes.
channel, make sure you pop them in the chat and we'll
Yeah,
see if
please
we can
do.
get to them
But
during the show. Let's talk Super Bowl odds here, Shane, for next year. Already looking ahead. As you can imagine, Pittsburgh Steelers not particularly high in terms of their Super Bowl odds right now, even with
yeah.
that 7-2 finish since the Week 9 bye. So far, FanDuel has them at plus 5,000 odds, which is good for the 21st best odds in the league. This is behind the Cleveland Browns, who are plus 3,500 odds. What do you make of that?
I think a lot of it is the fact that we as fans, and I think a lot of us at least know that even though this team finished hot and they finished well, it wasn't against the best competition. And this is a
Mm,
team going into its second year with a second year quarterback. They still have a lot of things to shore up along the offensive line, the defensive line, a lot of the important parts of building a team that's championship caliber, especially not just playoff caliber, but championship caliber. We're still behind the eight ball on a little bit. So I'm not surprised to see us all the way down here. I would have thought maybe closer to the middle just because of the fact that I think going into next year, if they do the right things, which we'll talk a little bit about the draft and other things, they could put themselves in like true playoff contention, not just, kind of sneaking at the end. But that's still not enough to really make them a Super Bowl odds favorite by any means, or even being, 14th, 15th best odds. So it does make
mm.
sense. I think they want to see like what this team actually does and if they can build up those worrisome spots before they give them much credit as far as Super Bowl odds or anything like that.
Yeah, I get it. I thought they probably would have been maybe just a little bit higher.
Like I said,
21st seems pretty low. I was thinking like
18th, 19th,
16, 18 range.
16,
Yeah,
something like that. Yeah.
something like that. But I do get it. And part of the reason why is because you've got Joe Burrow and you've got Cincinnati Bengals in there who have now almost twice in a row have gone to the Super Bowl. So it's hard to say that Steelers, first of all, are going to win that division. And then secondly, the AFC is getting loaded here. And the quarterbacks and this has a chance to be like a historically great quarterback conference. We saw like the emergence of Trevor Lawrence late in the season. And now that Justin Herbert probably has an offensive coordinator who's going to lead him a lot farther. I think that it's just going to be such a daunting road to get there. And I think that's why the odds are so low. It's not that they're the 21st best team. And maybe odds makers would probably view them a little bit higher, maybe the 14 to 16 range. But you have to factor in what you're going against in the route it takes to get there. And so I understand for sure why the Super Bowl odds are so low. Obviously, we're hoping that the Steelers show something different early in the season and the odds skyrocket. Maybe Pickett takes that step forward. But it's Lamar's going to be back. Deshaun Watson's going to be in a full season in his second season with Cleveland. And so they have the Steelers as the fourth team. I don't bet them to finish that way, Shane. If I had to bet, I'm going to make and I made this bet on DraftKings last year. I bet that they would finish third or better because I didn't trust the Browns. I did not trust the Browns. And Brissett did as well as I thought he could in that situation. But I thought that was a pretty safe bet to make at the time. And I was kind of regretting it a little early on with the 2-6 start. But I think that would probably be a reasonable bet to make again next year. I don't think the Steelers will finish dead last in the division. Mike Tomlin just has too much pride. He hasn't let it happen. And so I think that they're probably going to finish third if I had to put a number on it right now. Obviously, it's super early. But those are your Super Bowl odds right now. Certainly subject to change, even as we go through the offseason. Maybe odds makers are really going to like what Steelers do in free agency in the NFL draft, and that could give them a big boost as well. All right, let's talk about the Super Bowl, and this time from the Steelers' perspective, Shane. I want to talk about the most important notes that the Steelers could have possibly taken away from that game. Because when I was sitting there watching it, that's exactly what was going through my mind. I'm like, this is what the Steelers need to be doing at this point. So let's start with one. We'll go down the list. And if you have anything to add at the end, we'll add that. The first thing, Shane, is I think it's essential in today's NFL you must have a brilliant offensive-minded play caller. whether that is your offensive coordinator, whether that is your head coach. I think it's a necessity. And we looked at the 8 teams that were in the divisional round of the playoffs. 7 of those teams, with the only one that wasn't was Sean McDermott. 7 of those teams had offensive-minded head coaches as their play callers. And what happened to the Bills in that round? They scored 7 points and got humiliated by Cincinnati. And so, that's not to say that's going to happen every game, but you don't get enough consistency on offense when you don't have that mind that can scheme things open for you. And I think that's what we're seeing in today's NFL. Marcus Mosher broke this down just a little bit ago this week. And he went back and looked at all of the last 7 teams to win the Super Bowl. None of them have finished with an offense ranked worse than 7th. And so that's pretty telling. I feel it's so hard to use data from obviously like the 90s, the early 2000s, and even like the early 2010s, because the further we get away from that, the more the rules change in the NFL, the style of offenses change. And so we have to use the most recent sample. And the most recent sample, Shane, says that you need an elite offense. You need an elite offense to win this game. So what are your thoughts on that? Do you agree with me? Do you disagree? And if you agree, then how do Steelers go about changing that? Because obviously they're not getting rid of Mike Tomlin.
So I think the first issue here, and I think that I want to address this, is it doesn't necessarily mean that defense doesn't matter anymore, because clearly it does, especially defenses that are capable of pushing the right buttons when they need to. The Steelers defense is certainly a playoff caliber, and hopefully if they can shore up a couple spots, a Super Bowl caliber defense. The problem is having a Super Bowl caliber defense doesn't mean what it used to mean, because as good as offenses used to be and how talented they are, a combination of the rules and just the way guys are calling plays and the way that they can manipulate space and everything else, it's just so hard to, even when you play everything right, it's just so hard to not give up 20, 30 points sometimes through these really good offenses. And so it's not about whether the defense is not good enough or anything else. It's just, can your offense win your defense, even if it's really good, when it eventually falters? Because it's going to in the modern day. Can you come back from that? Can you counter-strike, basically? Steelers do not have a counterpunch to these offenses right now. The defense has to handle that for them, basically, and allow them to score 20 points to win the game. And we've talked about it. Against good teams that have at least a capable offense, it's just hard to ask your defense in 2023 coming up to limit them to less than 20 points. It's a lot to ask. And we'll do it occasionally. We did it this year. But you can't rely on wins that way. So how do you basically find a way? How do you score 25, 26, 27 points a game and let your defense give up 22, right? That's really what you're trying to do at this point. You're trying to get into that range where your defense is still really good, but not the only reason you win. And the offense doesn't have to be, spectacular, but it has to be able to get enough points on the board consistently to give your defense a chance. I think with Tomlin as the head coach, the defense part can be taken care of. It comes down to, can he find somebody outside of the organization, because that's going to be where it comes from, who can come in and actually, with Pickett and with what we have, figure out a way to score that 25, 26 points. And I think it's definitely possible with the talent we have. It's just, is he going to be able to find that guy and bring him here before someone else probably does, right? Because there are going to be other staffs looking for the same thing. He has to be proactive, and the rest of the team has to be proactive in finding that guy, and they haven't been able to do that in recent years.
Yeah, and I think the perfect example is just look at these last couple of games. You look at the Eagles and what they were able to do to the 49ers defense. So the 49ers had the number 1 DVOA defense and overall defense in the entire NFL this year. And the Eagles just stuck it to them in that conference game. And then we look at the Super Bowl. The Eagles had a remarkable defense this year too. I think they finished 3rd in defense. And they gave up 38 points. Now, 7 of those were a score on defense. And so it's a 31-point performance that you're still giving up. And so it shows you that you have to have obviously a combination of both, but the offense is what's been winning. I mean, it required 38 points for the Chiefs to win that game.
Yeah.
And so it was the offense that ultimately prevailed. But I think that's so essential in today's game. And we can look back even a couple of years when the Steelers were in the playoffs against the Kansas City Chiefs. And that game did not go well at all. And it's because of the offense. So the defense did their part. The first 4 or 5 drives, they didn't allow Mahomes and the Chiefs to cross the 50-yard line.
Yeah.
And TJ Watt had a defensive score. But even with that, the offense was so stagnant that it didn't matter. And the defense got so gassed by the end of the game that it just ended up being a blowout. And so I think it doesn't get talked about enough how important the offense is in comparison. I think that's where the Steelers need to be allocating more resources, allocating more of their money, because the evidence shows right now that is what it's going to take to win a Super Bowl. And so, unfortunately, they're not there yet. They don't have a lot of money. They are starting to invest more picks into their offense, and we hope they do so again this year. But that's going to have to turn around. All right, Shane, next on our list, most important notes to take away from the Super Bowl is this game is won in the trenches. And I mean, I think that's pretty clear. Now, obviously, Patrick Mahomes is a mastermind. He's phenomenal, and he's going to be a Hall of Famer someday. So I'm not taking anything away from him at all, even with the coaching thing and how brilliant Andy Reid is, because we saw some brilliantly designed plays in which he was able to just completely fool the Eagles defense, putting guys in motion and getting players wide open in space, not taking anything away from Mahomes or Andy Reid. But this game is decided by the trenches, essentially. And Kansas City's trenches held up very, very well. Now, some of that was the turf conditions there weren't exactly great.
Pass rushers,
yeah, that definitely dulled down the pass rush by how much everybody was slipping in that game. But you look at the investments the Chiefs have made into their offensive line. They went out and traded for and paid Orlando Brown Jr., Joe Thuney. They drafted Creed Humphrey, who is probably already the best center in the NFL. And so they're kind of stacked across the board. And so you look at the Eagles are the same way on the other side. And Kansas City really had trouble getting to them. It's part of the reason why Philadelphia was able to score 35 points in the Super Bowl, because Hurts was so well protected. And they're loaded with mammoths on that offensive line. And so I think that's so important, and we undersell how important that is as well. And especially look at the team like the Steelers, and what have they done in the last 12 years? I mean, we've already, in that entire span, they haven't spent more than a third round pick on their offensive line. So that's something that's going to have to change in the future.
Yeah, I think the number one thing with that is, I think people sometimes, because it's easy to forget about the offensive linemen, right? Because again, you don't hear about them unless they're terrible. Like honestly, that's just kind of how it works. So you don't really think about them too much. But what it allows you to do when you have offensive lines that are as talented as those two teams had is the amount of things you can do offensively, regardless of personnel, your quarterback. It just gets bigger, right? Like with Canada, I think especially, he has been under the assumption the past 2 years that they can't do long developing passing plays, that they can't do these things. And I think that does have a part in why his scheme is the way it is, although I think it's still just a him problem as far as scheming things up. I do think part of that has happened because he does not trust this offensive line to hold up in traditional, longer pass sets. And he's probably right about that. And that's the problem. And I think that until they can address that, whoever ends up being the guy who calls this offense long-term, because it's not going to be Canada. We think we all know that. The more you give him in terms of being able to protect your quarterback, the more things that he can add to his playbook, the things he can expand on and create some of these bigger plays that both of those teams are able to do because they were able to hold up in that pass protection. You look at the long ball to A.J. Brown. You look at some of the other ones that he just barely missed on with Hurts. Like, those happen because he had time to sit there and wait for the route to develop.
Yep.
The Steelers they haven't had the ability to do that, and they haven't really even tried to do that in recent years for a reason.
Yeah, I think they just go hand in hand. Like, obviously, the more time you have, the more plays you're going to be able to make down the field, the more you'll be willing to trust your quarterback across the middle without getting blindsided by a guy coming off the edge. And so I think that we all know that at this point. We understand that the Steelers, they've got to improve the offensive line still. They did fine in their roles, and I think they made some improvements in the second half of the season. But a couple of things to note: they're the healthiest offensive line in the league. They did not miss a single starter for a single game. Mason Cole only missed a handful of snaps, and outside of that, they were incredibly healthy. We can't expect that good health to continue. And again, like you already said, Shane, that if the Steelers want to have more of these explosive plays, you got to be able to hold onto the ball longer as a quarterback and go through progressions and try to make things happen over the middle of the field. That requires time in the pocket, time that I'm not sure, and I wouldn't trust at least Dan Moore and Okorafor to be able to give him on a consistent basis. And so I think upgrading the tackle position is going to be key. Obviously, Kevin Dotson could be replaced if the Steelers feel that that's a priority as well. So definitely things they can do there. I don't think they should be content, Shane. I don't think they should just settle and say, well, you guys worked well together last year. We were fine as a unit. We were able to run the ball, and that's good enough. I mean, I think that's a very warped mentality to have when it comes to the Steelers offensive line. You can get better, and you should get better, because you should not settle, particularly at the blindside tackle position, which is arguably the second most important position in football behind your quarterback. And you want to be able to pair Pickett with that guy that's going to be his protector basically throughout his career. Like, I want that Tyron Smith. I want that Trent Williams. I want that guy that's going to be there for the long haul, that you make a serious investment in, and is going to really better your offense. So I think we certainly learned from that game that the value of the trenches, and both sides of the trenches as well, because the offensive and defensive lines, that the Eagles and Chiefs had a lot of investments there, and those were paying off as well. But the offensive lines in particular did a good job during that Super Bowl. All right, Shane, in our third note we have here that Steelers should have been paying attention to is you got to get more talent. And unfortunately, it's not for a lack of effort. They've been trying to. It's just, I feel like these last few years, when you're buying the Eric Ebrons and the Trey Turners in free agency, and the Mason Coles, and nothing against Cole, Levi Wallace, you are parsing out your money to average starters at best, is essentially what they're doing. And then when it comes to the draft, I think the Steelers have pigeonholed themselves into drafting a particular position. And we see that from the scouting trail when Tomlin and Colbert were on the pro day trail. And it's like, I'm only looking at quarterbacks this year. I'm fixated on Najee Harris. And so they need to be able to branch out and genuinely say, I'm open-minded in the draft process. I'm going to take the best players at the most important positions, and I'm not going to fixate on one position and pigeonhole myself into making a decision that's going to cost me down the line just because I'm trying to fill a hole right now.
Yeah, I think the key thing with the whole talent argument is in free agency, I think there's two schools of thought with free agency. And I think the Steelers clearly have been in one camp versus the other. Is I like to think in free agency, you should do one of two things as far as signings. You should sign a premium player that you know is going to be at least an above average starter. Maybe he's not going to be quite as good as he was at his first stop, because we see that often, but you expect him to be a plug and play, like upgrade at an important position. Or you look for players who are being undervalued because they either only fit a certain niche or they don't only do a few things well, but they can do that thing for you at a cheap price. Those, you find those like coverage linebackers, receiving backs, those types of guys, right? Those are the two types of players you should ideally be looking to get, not these stopgap, like replacement level starters. That's where you draft guys second, third, fourth round. That's where you draft guys like that you can jump in immediately and be those types of players and hopefully be better than that in a year or two, right? That's ideally what you want to do. Steelers haven't really done that recently, and I think there's a reason for that. Obviously, they're focused on competing right now, opposed to competing for the future. That's just probably how it's going to be to a certain degree with this team as it is. But they have to find a better balance of that, right? Like if you're going to go sign somebody in free agency this year, make it a Deron Payne, make it a Jamel Dean, one of these premium players at an important position. If not, then just don't spend that money that you don't need to, right? Like keep some of that money, roll it over to next year. Don't overspend on guys that, they might be better than who you have now, but not so much better that's actually going to change you from a bottom team to a contender. Like that's just not going to happen with signings like that. We saw Miles Jack, that signing didn't change anything for us. Like those types of signings just don't really move the needle enough, right? That's what I think they have to do. And then in draft, like you said, you have to pick a player at an important position with your top picks. You just have to, in like whether that's corner, offensive tackle. We'll get into that more, but it has to be one of those types of players. And if not, you're really kind of wasting your time.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we're seeing that, and that's what we've seen in recent years in the NFL draft. In 2019, the Steelers spent first, second, and third round pick to move up for a linebacker. 2018, they got a safety in the first round who many thought was overvalued. The Steelers overvalued him, and then they took a running back in the first round of 2021. And so they're just allocating the resources incorrectly, if you will, and they're valuing the wrong positions early on. And so I think that needs to change. I like your philosophy when it comes to free agency. I agree with you there. The problem is the Steelers are too proud, I think, to roll that money over. They want to be competitive every single year, and they're going to spend every dime to make sure that they are. And that's why they're getting a Miles Jack, even though they structured his contract in a way that he would have an $11.25 million cap hit this year for the Steelers, which is absurd for I think a below average starting linebacker. And so they get themselves into these predicaments, then they eat more dead money and they keep eating it instead of stopping that trend for just 1 year and then rolling that extra cap space over, and then truly going out and getting a Jamil Dean or a player that's going to make a bigger impact like that you can kind of build a football team around. So definitely agree there. I think I'm encouraged. At least we've got Andy Weidel. We poached him from the Eagles. I think he did a tremendous job there, especially helping to build those trenches back up again. I mean, he was responsible for drafting Landon Dickerson, Jordan Davis, Jordan Mailata. And so some huge, beefy monsters on that offensive line that have really, really helped transform that Eagles team. I hope he kind of has the same mindset going in. And I hope that Tomlin and the Rooneys give him that flexibility to be able to say, yeah, these are your choices to make, because I think he's done some good things over there. So I'm definitely encouraged. And then with the draft capital that we have this year as well. All right. If you are a fan of the Pittsburgh Steelers and you would like to support the Steel Curtain podcast, please consider subscribing to the Steel Curtain podcast on YouTube. We appreciate all of your support. Okay, Shane, let's talk about the most frequently mocked players to the Pittsburgh Steelers. Now, we're still super early in the pre-draft process. The combine hasn't even started. That's going to kick off here in February 27th. But let's look at this. And I've got this pulled up right now as well. This is from the NFL mock draft database, where they take a collection from all the sites, including our own, of the mock drafts that are out there. And they show which players are most frequently mocked. And so we're going to kind of go through some of the top names here on the list. We're going to touch on a handful of these. We won't do any too long. We'll do more in-depth breakdowns of these players later on in the process. Yep. But let's just touch a few minutes on each of these quick hitters. And the first one is not going to surprise a soul out there. If you've been following along, or even if you haven't, you probably know the name Joey Porter. And thus you're going to know the name Joey Porter Jr., cornerback for Penn State. He is the most mocked player to the Pittsburgh Steelers, according to the NFL mock draft database, by a wide margin. And it's not surprising to see that. And even those in the national media are mocking him to the Steelers, and I think for pretty obvious reasons. Now, it's worth noting that Porter Sr. and Tomlin did not overlap in terms of player coach. Yep. There was a 1-year difference. So Porter Sr., he was gone that year, and then that was the offseason that Tomlin came in. He still knows him very well. There's still connections with the organization. I'm sure they're talking. And so I don't think it's just smoke. I don't think we can say that anymore and say these teams don't do that. I mean, they're not all about saying, I'm playing chess, not checkers. I'm gonna fake everybody out. No, we know that the Steelers like Najee. We know some of the players they like. And so we're gonna really be able to find that out at the combine here. And then during the scouting trail, when the Steelers go to these pro days, I'd have to imagine that Tomlin and Weidel and Kahn are at Penn State this year, wouldn't you?
Yeah, I mean, again, this is one of those things where everything lines up, right? Where there's a need at the position. It's a player who they should be very familiar with because of obviously Joey Porter Sr., his time playing there, being coached there. Like it just makes sense, right? And I don't blame anybody for taking that as the approach of as far as like what they would want to do in the draft. We've seen them kind of fixate on guys. You mentioned Najee before, you mentioned, quarterback last year. Like they don't exactly, try not to tip their hand in some situations. I don't know if that's going to play out this way during the process, but it wouldn't be surprising if we see a lot of talk about them going to Penn State, talking to Joey a lot. And, I do like the idea of it because, again, we need corner. I think it just comes down to, is it going to be the best pick at the time? Because pick 17 could get a little bit dicey just because if there's a run on tackles, is he the best corner left? Is he the guy that makes the most sense? Is there another corner that maybe, and we'll talk about, one of these guys here in a minute, that maybe is a better fit or maybe more what they're looking for? It's not it's not a guarantee of any kind, but again, everything lines up for it to make sense at the time they're going to be picked. And we'll kind of just see how these teams evaluate these corners and who's put in what spots, because I think that's going to matter a lot too.
Yeah, and Porter's not guaranteed to be there either. It's going to come down to preference by these teams. This is a very strong cornerback class at the top end. Yeah. And the more that I'm seeing now, Porter's gone inside the top 10 this year. And so I don't know if he's going to last to 17 or not. I do think it makes a lot of sense. I would not be upset with this pick, from what I've seen. No. I think Porter can get really grabby, but he's also got exceptionally rare traits. When you are 6'2 plus, 200 pounds plus, and he's said to have between 34 and 35 inch arms. We'll see exactly where those come in, but it's going to be like 99th or 100th percentile among cornerbacks. That length matters so much at that position, probably more than anything outside of offensive tackle, because you use it every single play to put your hand in passing lanes, break up balls. And so that's going to offer him a huge advantage at the next level. I can see him as one of those guys who's a much better pro than he is as a college player. The takeaway number is a little bit concerning there. I think he only just had one career interception at Penn State. I wouldn't be too concerned with it.
Though,
a lot of passes defensed, and it's just a very physical player. So the Steelers are going to love this guy. Not hard to see at all why he's the most frequently mocked, and I think he should. I think, I think if somebody put a gun to my head right now, I'm saying, I think Porter. It's going to be Porter. That would make a lot of sense. Pick because assuming that he's on the board, I think he's going to be a hard one for them to pass up, and we'll see as we go throughout this process. Next name on the list. So these are the two. These are the two guys. The next name on the list is the other one that is so frequently linked to the Steelers, not necessarily because wide receivers are biggest need, although Deontay Johnson is coming off of a very less than spectacular season, was one of the least efficient starting receivers in football last year, but Jordan Addison, because of his connection with Kenny Pickett and playing in that Pitt offense together. And Pickett had an exceptional year at Pitt. I mean, he led his team to an ACC championship. His numbers were off the chart. They elevated so much when he played with Addison there. And Addison had 100 catches, 1,500 yards, 17 touchdowns. He was electric for that team and for Kenny Pickett specifically. So the question here would come to how important is wide receiver for the Steelers, knowing that they spent a second-round pick on George Pickens, Deontay's under contract, and how much flexibility would they give and say, hey, Pickett, what do you think of this? Right? What if we were to do something like this? Do you think you get your use out of him? I don't know if they would come to their second-year quarterback and speak that kind of language. But if they think that Pickett is the guy and they want to get help around him, and let's say a couple of the offensive tackles are already off the board and Addison is sitting there, then perhaps that's a possibility.
I think this is so tough because it makes a lot of sense. We've seen teams, if you give your young quarterback an elite weapon, how much that changes the game for them, right? Mm-hmm. The problem is, I think if we didn't have Matt Canada coming back this year, I might like this pick more, even though ultimately it probably would only be a year-long mistake, type of thing. But I think I'd like to pick a little bit more if I was confident that you brought him into a situation where he could thrive even as a rookie with Pickett. I think so much of what they would end up doing production-wise would come not from the offense, but from just them working out, which is totally fine as well. I mean, that would still help. But I do wonder if it'd be the best fit because of that. I don't know if this is a passing game right now that's conducive to the types of plays that these two made with each other in college. I don't know if that would happen very much in the pros, at least early on. But again, you can't really ignore how much bringing a elite weapon into an offense can help a young quarterback, and we desperately need any help we can get for him at this point. And so it would make a lot of sense. I just do wonder, like I said, is the timing right for it for a pick like this right now, or is it better to fortify the trenches, like you said? And again, maybe somehow the corners and the tackles, maybe there's a huge run on both of them, and maybe Addison is just the best player there. In which case, I can't really blame them for taking him in that situation.
Yeah, I'm all for trying to help the offense and to help Kenny Pickett. I think that Steelers' number one goal for these next couple of years needs to be don't let Kenny Pickett fail at all costs. I mean, you need to get him help on the offensive line. You need to get him another weapon in the passing game at some point. Doesn't necessarily have to be right now or in the draft. Could be in free agency or even with like a second tight end or somebody else who can help him in the passing game. But my thing with Addison is, I don't view him as a true first-round graded player. And I think that that's where I'm going to differ from some people. I see him very much in like the Robert Woods type mold of football player, where he's going to run really good routes. He's just going to be a guy that you can kind of pepper with targets, and he's going to do a lot of things really well. I don't see him as that exceptional player who's worthy really of being like a top 15 selection. The Steelers are just outside of that. And so maybe that's something that they would consider. But we compare him to receivers in like last year's class. I mean, that was a really strong class. George Pickens was the 10th receiver taken or 11th receiver taken. There was 10 guys taken before him last year. So I think that it's a relatively weak receiver class. And I don't want Steelers to be forced to take one just for the sake of taking one. Obviously, we'll know a lot more as we go throughout the process. And Addison is a good player. He's, I think, consensusly a top 2 receiver, along with TCU's Quentin Johnson in this class. And so if a top 2 receiver is available for you, it's obviously something that needs to be considered. I just think that the receiver class isn't particularly strong overall. And I hate spending a first round pick on one unless I am getting that true, like, number one difference making type player. And I kind of view Addison probably more as that number two in the NFL. Although I would be in favor of reducing Johnson's 147 targets down to like 100. It wasn't good last year from him. So obviously we hope he can take a step forward.
I will say there is some other receivers that I think maybe closer to pick 32-49 that I think would be a better fit, but we'll talk about that at a later time.
Yeah, for sure. Because that's something that just needs to be weighed. Like, that's 17th pick is valuable. And the Steelers typically don't pick there. They typically pick in the 20s. And so when you have that, are you going to spend it on a receiver with no guarantee of getting that second contract and knowing that he's going to be that third receiver to start the season at least? Or do you want to invest that in an offensive lineman? Like, I would certainly choose the offensive lineman. I like those prospects. So I like the top 3 offensive tackle prospects better than I like Addison anyway. And I think it's a more important position for what the Steelers need, obviously. But it's something that they could definitely consider. And I would expect them to have that visit. Obviously he's not there in Pitt anymore, but they're very familiar with him, obviously. So
of course,
I think that one, I think they're going to use one of their visits on him there. Let's talk about Broderick Jones a little bit. Now, technically, by the NFL mock draft database, Broderick Jones is the second most frequently drafted player, mock drafted player to the Pittsburgh Steelers, behind only Joey Porter. And I find that interesting, and I like it because I'm a big Broderick Jones fan. As a young guy, freaky athlete. I mean, the guy might run a 4.85 or a 4.9 at the combine, and not that that's that important for offensive tackle, but it's worth noting that the all-pro offensive tackles right now, they run sub 4.5s, all the ones in the NFL. And so just something interesting to note there, because those guys are typically so freaky in what they do that they can make up with any deficiencies because of their just elite athletic traits. I think that Jones is going to be gone before their pick, sadly. It's hard to see him like getting past like the Tennessee Titans at pick 11, especially if Paris Johnson is already off the board. But it's worth noting that he's a guy that's frequently mocked to the Steelers.
Yeah, I think you're right though, and that's kind of the issue is because of the type of player that he is, right? He's not necessarily like, and we'll talk about this player a little bit later, like a Peter Skoronsky type of like the technical, the like refined player. He's not, by super raw by any means either, but this is a guy that blows up at the combine and gets taken inside the top 10, if not outside of it. And he kind of feels that way. We'll see what he actually looks like in drills at the combine and see if that really impacts anything. But if he does test like the athlete I expect him to test like, and just looks as fluid as he did at Georgia, some team is going to either come up for him that isn't the Steelers probably, or they're going to just take him inside the top 10 if they need to. But again, this would be a perfect fit. I think he's the guy that of the like higher upside tackles, if he can get all the way to 17, it's a slam dunk pick. You have to take him. He's a guy that could easily become at least Pro Bowl caliber player for you, I think, relatively quickly. But again, I think it comes down to just, is he even going to be there? If he's mocked to us a lot, but that's, different mock draft machines and stuff like that. Like, they're not factoring everything in. He feels like the type of guy though that is going to rise enough where we'd either have to go get him, which I didn't expect him to do, or again, he just won't be there at 17.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I mean, if I had to bet right now, he is not there, and he probably doesn't even come within a few picks of the Steelers, because I do think that he's one of those guys. He's just going to blow up the combine. I mean, I've watched a lot of his games so far, and his movement skills are phenomenal. I mean, the way that this guy moves, he has that similar body type to like a Tyron Smith type guy, where you're just chiseled, rocked. You get the long arms. You're a young guy. You're doing it without a lot of experience, and he's only going to get better. I mean, you project forward, he could be a terrific player at the next level. Just a guy that I'm really high on this year. But yeah, like you said, probably not going to be there. It's worth noting too that, I mean, he comes from a great football program at Georgia. Andrew Thomas, who just came from there a few years back, is probably already the second or third best left tackle in the NFL right now. And so,
he's really
and I think that I think that Jones's ceiling is just as high as what Andrew Thomas's was, and so certainly could be a valuable player. Could be one of the most valuable offensive players in the league if the trajectory remains the same right now. So I don't see that one being there for the Steelers, but it's worth mentioning because he is high on their most frequently mocked list. Next name that we have here is Devin Witherspoon. he's actually the third most frequently mocked. And so Jordan Addison wasn't, but I wanted to throw him in there second because he's the most talked about player, the second most talked about player behind Joey Porter Jr., but not quite the most frequently mocked player to the Steelers. And I think a lot of it has to do with need in the Steelers' needs elsewhere. But Devin Witherspoon is. And this one I find interesting as well for very similar reasons to Broderick Jones. From what I'm hearing right now, it sounds like he's going to go inside the top 10 somewhere.
That's kind of the issue, is because with Witherspoon, he's a very good athlete. He's not quite as big or as long as Joey Porter Jr., not quite as probably explosive as some of the other guys, like Christian Gonzalez, but he is the complete package at corner from what I've been able to see of him and what I've heard. From a technical standpoint, he's much closer to, in terms of his ability to come right out of college and play closer. He'll probably not be anything like Sauce Gardner this past year. That's a special player.
Yeah.
But in the same mold of, like, he's ready to go right now. Like, there's no concern for me that he's not going to be able to come in and at least be a quality number one corner, if not a high-end number 2 corner right off the bat. And that's just very valuable for some of the teams in the top 10 that don't have the ability to stop the pass game. It really helps them to at least have a better chance of it. And I'm not going to be surprised, like you said, if he ends up going top 10. And he might be the only corner that goes top 10. It really just depends on what teams are valuing in the top 10 this year, even though the corners are probably worth selections in that range. He's the most likely, I think, at this point to actually end up going in that range.
Yeah, like I said, it's going to come down to preference. Do teams like Witherspoon, do they like Christian Gonzalez? Do they like Joey Porter? I think it's probably one of those 3 guys. And whoever falls to the Steelers, maybe they would consider that guy, because I do think they're all in the same tier. They just each offer something a little bit different. I think that Porter's not quite as consistent as the other two, and not as big of like a splash playmaker at this point in time. But he's got a lot of upside. Witherspoon, like you said, really the complete package. I have him just a little bit under the Patrick Surtain and the JC Horn to come out in recent years. He's not in that level, but I think there's 3 guys or so that are in that next tier down from him. Certainly worth a top 10 or 15 pick. And so I don't know if Witherspoon's going to be there. He does fit the bill of everything they look for. Incredibly physical player. And Tomlin is going to love this guy. So I can see why he's been mocked there. And some from the mainstream media have mocked him to the Steelers as well. So that one makes a lot of sense. Let's look at the next name on the list. And this is Trenton Simpson, linebacker out of Clemson. We could strongly make a case that linebacker is the worst position on the Steelers, and it might get worse than it is right now because Devin Bush is an unrestricted free agent. So is Robert Spillane. And so you're losing Bush. I don't see any way that he comes back. I don't know if the team would want him back. I don't know if he would want to come back under any circumstances unless he can't find a home anywhere else, but he doesn't play special teams. So he's not coming back to be a special teams player for them. And so, I mean, the Steelers really, they're going to be down to Miles Jack, who they got to figure out what they're doing with his contract there. I'm not content keeping that at $11.25 million cap hit, and the Steelers shouldn't be either. Robert Spillane, who they're going to have to re-sign as a reserve linebacker and a special teams player, and Mark Robinson. And I'm not even counting Marcus Allen as a linebacker, really. I mean,
he doesn't play.
Core special teams player. That is it. He's the up back. He's not going to see the field on defense. So this team is really, really weak at the position. I would expect them to look for someone in free agency, first of all, to cover their bases. But then in the draft, I can see them doing something like this. It scares me a little bit because this is kind of like in the same camp to me nowadays, and the analytics would suggest the same as taking like the running back in the first round. It's kind of like the running back of the defense. These off-ball linebackers, they don't have as long of careers. Hardly any of the best off-ball linebackers in the NFL are first-round picks. Most of them are day 2 picks. And so I'm just not a huge fan of doing this. I do think that Simpson is a good player. He's well-rounded. He has a little bit of Shazier qualities to his game in terms of his ability he can line up in the slot. He can blitz from the middle. He can blitz from the outside. He can do a lot of different things. He's good in coverage. He can make some splash plays. He fits a similar size profile as Shazier, coming out not to that caliber, I don't think. That's back in that 2014 draft where you had Shazier and Mosley, who were both really good prospects coming out. So he's a step down from that, and I think that there's no doubt in my mind that Simpson would help improve this team. It's just, would you take an off-ball linebacker in the first round, considering that it's not a money position and that there are so many other pressing needs that you have at more important positions on the team?
Yeah, I think it's tough because this is the type of linebacker that the Steelers should be trying to acquire in some way, shape, or form. He is a true rangy cover type of linebacker. He's a full size player, especially by today's standards. He could develop into a 3 down like true impact starter as a linebacker. The problem is you can't take him at 17. I think. I just think one, it's too early for him in general.
Mhm.
Regardless, if you take him at 32 or even better 49. Sure. That's good value because you're getting a guy who I think can start right away, can be the guy that you haven't had, like I said, as a cover linebacker. That I'm okay with, especially if you get a tackle early and maybe the corners that are left aren't really what you want at 32, then maybe you take a Simpson or something like that. That would make a lot of sense.
Mhm.
17, though, like I said, that is just too rich for really any linebacker, in my opinion, at this
Yeah.
point. You kinda touched on it. But especially when there's going to be players probably at maybe even defensive line, at hopefully corner at least, if not tackle, that's going to be there that are better players and a higher value player. You can't pass on any of those guys to take a Trenton Simpson at 17.
Yeah, and I think a good way to view this, Shane, if we look at it like this, there are lots of cornerbacks that I would be willing to trade my first round pick for, that
Mhm.
if I can get them for the rest of their career. And how many linebackers in the NFL right now would you be willing to do that for? I
Not
mean, like
not
there's like
many.
Fred Warner.
Yeah.
So what I'm saying is if you were to trade your pick away and take on their money, there's only a couple linebackers in the entire
Yeah,
NFL
not
that are
many.
worth trading a first round pick for. So what makes you think that first of all, you're going to get one of those guys with your first round pick? It's more
Mhm.
likely than not that you don't.
Right.
And secondly, when it comes time to pay this guy, are you going to be willing to fork up money if there's only a couple linebackers out there that are worth their massive contracts right now? And I think that Fred Warner is one of the few, and they're really few and far between. And so I think that this is becoming a position anymore where teams are like, yeah, I'm going to draft a linebacker almost every year on day 2. And then we're going to kind of rinse and repeat and go through the process. And these guys are going to get beat up. They're going to get worn down. Their best years are going to be from age 23 to 26 or 27. And then we're going to kind of move on. And so in that sense, they are becoming a lot like running backs. And so I like Simpson. I think he's a solid football player. I like him, like you said, much better in the second round than I do at 17. For the Steelers perspective, which is what we're kind of looking at here because of these mock drafts, I think he'll certainly be on their radar. I think they'll certainly do their homework with him, depending on what they do in free agency. I mean, if they go out and sign 2 guys at the linebacker position in free
Probably
agency,
not. Yeah,
they're not
probably
going to
not.
be interested. And
No.
I probably don't see them doing that. But one guy or less, I mean, he's going to be on their radar. And again, he's right from their scouting region here. They're familiar with that school, familiar with him as a prospect, I'm sure. But yeah, not a pick that Shane or I would be a huge fan of with the 17th selection there, like he's being mocked. Let's look at Peter Skoronski, the Northwestern offensive tackle. And I say tackle lightly right now because I just don't know, Shane. I mean, I really, really wish this guy had 33 and a half, 34-inch arms, and I would feel so good about him. There's rumors out there that his arm length might come in under 32 inches, and that is concerningly small for me. I think it's one of those things that it has to be evaluated. You can't just be thrown out the window. And I was cutting up some of his film just the other day where when he gets that long arm into the chest, I mean, he's getting pushed backwards. There's as strong as he is, there's nothing he can do about it because he just can't reach the edge in front of him. And so that's something that needs to be considered. I think his tape is really good overall. I mean, he's graded out very well. You see that on tape. He's got the traits. He's an athlete. He comes from a Big Ten football program, and there's a lot to like about his game. It's just that he's got that one concerning thing about him. So, how do you view him, Shane, at the next level? What position do you think he'd have to be? Is he a guy that should be high on Steelers' radar?
I think that what's good for Peter Skronsky is the fact that I'm pretty confident, and most people seem confident that if you draft him to be a tackle and he can't do it, he's going to move inside
Mhm.
and probably be a Pro Bowl guard pretty quickly.
Yeah.
I think that's the benefit with him is you're getting a guy who is capable because of his athleticism and his size. He's able to move inside to guard and play very well there if he can't be a tackle. But I think teams will owe it to themselves, especially just based on his tape and the fact that he's already very refined as a pass protector. Like he kind of understands that he isn't the longest arm guy, so he tries to avoid that being an issue. I think you owe it to him and yourself to play him at tackle early on until he shows he can't. But
Mhm.
at this point, I think that because it's very likely, just based on his measurements, that him being a tackle long term could become a situation where he's maybe only a starting caliber tackle instead of an above average or Pro Bowl caliber tackle.
Mhm.
Is it more valuable to have him move inside then and maybe be that, again, like I said, Pro Bowl caliber, even all pro caliber type of guy? That's, I think, what you have to weigh. But it's pick 17. I'm not as
Mhm.
worried about that because if I'm confident I'm getting a very good player regardless, I'm not as worried about it. But 17 for a guy who might end up being a guard is a little bit pricey, but we've seen players go in that range and be very, very good. So I'm not going to knock that either. I think if he's the best offensive lineman left, then I'm totally fine with it. If there's guys that I think maybe are going to be better at tackle or need long term at tackle, that's still on the board. Maybe you address a different position and try to get one of those guys with your second pick.
Yeah, because of his position flexibility projected forward, I think that he's one of the safest players in the
I would
draft
say
in
so,
that
yeah.
regard.
Yeah.
But it just comes down to a matter of, do the Steelers view him as an offensive tackle? And I think that greatly increases his value if they do.
Yes.
Now, ideally, in a perfect world, if you went with a guy like Skoronski, you could say, all right, yeah, you're my starting left tackle. Dan Moore, you're going back to being my
Ideally,
swing
yeah.
guy. And even if you just prove to be average because the length does give you a lot of issues, that's fine for now. You're still an upgrade over what we had. And when we find a true left tackle down
Mhm.
prospect a year or two later, we'll bump you over to guard. You'll be
Right.
great there. And so, and like you said, I don't think you can really go wrong with the pick. It's just a matter of, is the guy a guard? Is he a tackle? Some of you even flirted with saying maybe he's a center. Depending on how
I mean,
short those
hey,
arms come, if
yeah,
he's
hey,
got 31-inch arms, maybe he's a center. I think he could do anything on the interior. I
I
don't
think so.
question that at all.
Yeah.
And he has all the traits to be a left tackle in the NFL. He just doesn't have the length, or at least not what we're told. We'll find that official measurement here in about 2 weeks at the NFL Combine, and so it's going to be really interesting. I think that's one of the big numbers everybody's waiting to see. But again, Skoronski, I have mocked him personally to the Steelers. I can see it happening, especially if Paris Johnson is gone, if Broderick Jones is gone. The Steelers, if they want an offensive tackle, if that's a position, and Andy Weidel has valued it obviously in the past with the Eagles, and so if that's something they're eyeing, I can certainly see him being the pick there if he happens to fall that far. And again, he's another one of those guys. I think that depending on what team likes him and how they view him, he could be long gone before the 17th pick anyway, because he's that
Possibly,
good of a
yeah.
player, at least in college. We've got one more name on the list for now. And obviously we're going to dive into these a little bit deeper as we
Mhm.
go throughout the process. But that is Florida offensive guard, O'Cyrus Torrence. I went back in and watched the All-22 film at the Senior Bowl. I watched the O-line, D-line drills a couple times each. I thought Torrence was very impressive there. Very impressive. And that's a drill that favors the defensive player, because it's
A
essentially a
one-on-one, yeah.
one-on-one, and there's open field in front of you. Typically you're going to have obviously the rest of the offensive line playing. They can help chip in, more congestion there. And so he pretty much stonewalled everybody you win against. I mean, there's maybe 2 or 3 reps that weren't perfect, but the rest was exceptional. And it's a guy that's got immense power, long arms, huge frame. I think he's pretty much the total package that you would want, at least look for in a guard. And so I think that even though, like we talked about already a little bit, Shane, guard's certainly not as valuable as tackle. I think that's a much more replaceable position. The money reflects that as well, because they don't get that paid as much. But I think that Torrence is a player that could definitely be in play here at that 17th pick.
I think it's definitely possible, and I think the question for the Steelers is, and this is the thing that they have to decide, because we know our opinion on it. We know that we think Dan Moore is the weakest link of this offensive line. We'd like to see an upgrade at left tackle.
Mm-hmm.
If they don't feel that way, if they feel that maybe Kevin Dotson is the weakest link, or they feel that they can upgrade that spot more assuredly with the draft pick, Cyrus Torrence is about as good as you're going to get as far as what they want to do as well.
Yeah.
He will open up holes in their own game. Like that's really not a question at all. I think as a
Mm-hmm.
pass blocker, he's shown enough again in the drills and in college as well that you're not worried about him being like an actual liability in any way. If anything, he could end up becoming a very good guy, especially stonewalling the bigger, stronger inside or interior players. It would be very on brand for them to take a guy like this. Let me put it that way. If they're trying to build up the trenches in a way that allows them to run the football, which is what we know they want to do, this is the guy to do that. And I think he even more so than Skoronski would be, even though I think Skoronski's probably a better player overall. I would understand if they're going to go interior player, if they view him as an interior player as well, they probably
Mm.
would rather go with Torrance for just the fit for what they're looking for.
Yeah, and I can see that being the case as well. And I mean, if Steelers got a David DeCastro, nobody's going to be upset about that. Doesn't matter if he's a guard or anything at that
It
point.
doesn't matter now.
Unlikely that he ends up being that multi-time
No,
all-pro
but
guy, but I think he could certainly be a Pro Bowl level guard. I mean, this is a good football player. And just like Skaronski, I think that Osiris Torrance is one of the safest players in the entire draft just because he has everything. And where Skaronski doesn't check the box in arm length, Torrance checks even that box as well. He checks every box. The feet aren't always there. They're a little bit inconsistent still. Needs to clean up his technique, but he's a good enough athlete, and you can see it on film. And so I think he's one of the most well-rounded overall prospects in terms of his position. I think the guard position has been a little bit devalued in recent years because as we move to the passing game, it's the tackles offer significantly more value. And it's easier to replace that guard. As we saw this last year when Steelers replaced two of their offensive linemen, and were arguably the two best offensive linemen on the team last year in Mason Cole and James Daniels in the interior. So that's easier to replace than the tackle position. You don't have those guys ever floating out there in free agency like that. And at least not for substantial amounts of money for the premier tackles. So I do like Osiris Torrance a lot. I think he's a little bit rich for 17. Ideally, I'd love to be able to get him like a trade back situation. And that's, again, something that Andy Weidel has done with the Eagles in the past is that team has traded back. They've got as many darts as they can throw at the board, essentially. And that's how they end up with players like Jordan Mailata, who's a very good offensive tackle because they able to compile so many picks that you're bound to hit on some of these guys in those mid rounds there. So definitely something to keep an eye on. We will break down all of these players and more in future episodes, but thank you for joining us today. That's all the time we have. You can follow Shayne on Twitter at Shayne Kubas. You can follow me on Twitter at Tommy Jaggi. You can download the Steel Curtain podcast wherever you get your podcast, and also check us out on YouTube. Thanks for listening to the Steel Curtain podcast.